The topic for this program today is critical to the health and sustainability of our nation. Education has been recognized as a basic human right by many international conventions. However, providing education with the pressures and challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the gaps and shortcomings in our educational systems and disparities in our nation. These gaps have become more apparent, troubling, and challenging. According to the current UNICEF data, more than 1 billion children worldwide are at risk of falling behind in their educational knowledge due to school closures to stem the spread of COVID-19. Those in the poorest of households suffer the greatest impact due to limited or insufficient access to the internet, personal computers, and an environment conducive to learning. Couple these findings with student learning challenges that pre-existed the pandemic. Insufficient or inadequate parental support and an inadequately structured home environment conducive to learning. Our speaker today will address the educational health of our community, particularly the effect of the dual pandemic on students, parents, and staff in Baltimore City. Dr. Sonja Santelises, the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, has brought her expertise to this position since July 2016. With degrees from Brown, Columbia, and Harvard, and her prior experiences as Baltimore City's Chief Academic Officer, she is known for building high-quality teaching and learning with a hands-on approach to helping students excel. During the presentation, feel free to enter your questions into the chat. Moderator, Mara Braverman, an experienced communications professional and active member of the circle, will consolidate and announce them for Dr. Santelises at the end of her formal presentation. Please note we have muted your microphones for the entire session. A recording of the meeting will be available in the future. Special recognition to the Circle Study Committee under the capable leadership of Sue Talbot and Pam Young for creating another timely full circle program. Thanks to all present for your support of Baltimore Women's Giving Circle and our speaker today. Here are inspiring parting thoughts from Mother Teresa. Life is a struggle, accept it. Life is an opportunity, benefit from it. Thank you.
Wonderful. It is, I just thank you for that. I haven't had an intro that ends with Mother Teresa, I think, ever. So I appreciate that. She is an incredible hero of mine, still beginning in high school and starting until now. So thank you very much for that. It's wonderful to be here with you all this morning or actually this afternoon now. That shows where my head is. Also, I just want to thank Delegate Learman for making the connection and her request. She's always so supportive of Baltimore City Public Schools, both as a parent and as an elected official. So shout out there. And it's wonderful to see everyone virtually. I won't, because of the of where we are, get to see you all at once yet. And I know that there are a number of people here, but more than happy to get started with the presentation. And it really is you really are, as was stated earlier, in a probably one of the most interesting times in U.S. education, minimally in 100 years, and I would argue probably longer than that. If you look at the charge of the country's schools to educate not just the elite or higher income, whatever your definition of that is, but really to fulfill what I believe the charge of public education is, which is to educate all children to high levels. And so we find ourselves, I will tell you, I will start out humorously. And I said to my board chair, Linda Chinia, she and Janet Richardson, who's our vice chair, do a fabulous job of leading Baltimore City Public Schools Board of Commissioners. And I said to them, you know, if I didn't know better, I would think that you knew that the pandemic was coming when you asked me to sign my second contract in February, because literally it was about 2 weeks after I signed my contract that the full force of the pandemic was coming into view. So this was not the way I wanted to begin my second term in Baltimore City, but I can't think of a more timely place to actually be during this time. So thank you all for that. Now, I don't know if I am, very good, must mean Jenny or someone's here, that's good. So just by way of overview, because I know that a lot of folks have interest in kind of where we are. People have been following the news and probably know some of the basics around some of the early challenges and really shifting in the second half of what I call pandemic schooling up until now, to know that a majority of schools and school districts actually across the state are still, Maryland more so than other states, you still have an overwhelming majority of students being educated virtually. So for virtual learning where we are now, we've distributed to date about 47,000 Chromebooks, which you can see we have about 55,000 total. So we still have some to distribute. We have about 10,700 hotspots distributed, which you can see here. I think the big news on that, two headlines on that, are one, the overwhelming support we've had from the larger community in an acknowledgement that the digital divide left whole communities, frankly, left our country and our school systems flat-footed in actually responding to the digital divide that we had knowledge was a reality for probably close to 2 decades, but this pandemic kind of brought that in view. So we had a lot of outpouring from the community that has helped with that. I just left a meeting now on attendance. And so you'll see right now we have about 80% of students logging into platforms daily. The challenge with that 80% is that the 20% that are not means we have anywhere from 15,000 to about 17,000 students who are not logging in daily. So that could mean some portion of that are the same students, some are different students, and a lot of what we're seeing, again, I'm just kind of fresh from an attendance meeting, is that there are a variety of factors that are contributing to the spotty attendance and increase and uptick in chronic absenteeism. But we have come a long way from a district that had about a 1-to-5 ratio. We are now just better than 1 in 2. So we're not quite at 1 in 1, but that is within a short period of time. We really have increased the accessibility, and we just also sealed an agreement with T-Mobile for an additional 10,000 hotspots for families within the city. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I also thought would be interesting by way of update is to really share some of what we're seeing from our family surveys. I think one of the silver linings of this challenging period of time of what many have called a triple or almost like a trifecta pandemic of health, racial challenges, and economic challenges all coming to bear. But one of the silver linings is that we have really been able to move to additional ways of engaging families. And so we have shorter surveys, quick surveys now that go to family cell phones. And while they may not be as in-depth, we actually are hearing from far more families than we might regularly. So one of the things that you'll see in that orange box in the corner is that we've had 20,000 responses to our POSSEP phone surveys, which far exceeds what we would regularly receive if we were sending local surveys through through email. So you can see some of the highlights here. One of the things that I would say as an overall theme, because I know everybody here can read the slides, a couple of things I would point to, though, is we have seen an increase in family satisfaction from the spring. So the good news is that the work that teachers put in, the work that school principals put in, that the district support teams put in making sure that we improved the virtual learning experience is manifesting, and it's manifesting at the school level. We've actually seen an uptick in some grades with regards to enrollment. But we are down overall about 1%, and that is overwhelmingly in our pre-K grades. But in some grades, we've actually gained, not only sustained, but actually gained enrollment in some of those grade levels. But again, the bottom line here is we have seen a trajectory of improvement from spring to fall, but the bottom line is we still have large numbers of families, about a third, who, anywhere from 25% to a third, who really are looking for different options for their children because the virtual environment just is not best for everyone. The quality of what we've done is increased, but we still, and by the way, that a third matches, I think, and Jenny can correct me if I'm wrong, it's very close to the percentage of respondents who say that they would want to send their children back in person. That was pre-surge, but definitely you see the correspondence between those figures. Next slide, please. So one of the things I think is really important when we talk about learning loss, and everybody keeps talking about how much ground young people are missing, and I wanted to be able to bring some data to bear. McKinsey has been tracking since early in the spring what the projected learning loss would be for students. As a matter of fact, as part of the National Chiefs for Change organization, we actually had 3 or 4 sessions with McKinsey in April, which was still relatively early on. And so as we were reviewing these figures, we knew that we were going to have to really begin building out options for making up lost time. But I think when people talk about the pandemic, being able to quantify that, you see in this slide. So if you look at the average months of learning lost with typical in-classroom teaching, so this isn't being compared to outstanding classroom teaching, but just typical in-classroom teaching and average quality remote teaching, you're looking at about a 3 to 4 month loss of learning. And that's if you have average remote learning and compare it to average or typical in-classroom teaching, you're talking right out of the gate, anywhere from 3 to 4 months. When you get into low quality remote learning, and again, it's why the quality indicator of the remote learning is really important, you're then jumping to 7 to 11 months. One of the particularly stunning things for us early on, which is why we knew we needed to improve our remote learning over the summer and into the fall, we front loaded a lot of our teacher professional development days because teachers told us we don't have as much familiarity, as fabulous a job as they did turning on a dime in the spring, teachers were telling us at the end of June, we need more. And part of what you see here between the low quality remote learning and no instruction, which was frankly very disheartening to me, is that there's very little difference in the gravity of the loss on the upper end. So very low quality remote learning is almost indistinguishable from no instruction at all, because you're talking low quality learning can lead to up to 11 months of loss compared to 12 to 14 months of loss with no instruction. And so part of what really we're having to grapple with when we talk about the rush back into buildings, and some people characterize it as a rush, I would characterize it as a prioritization. It's looking at this kind of data. So when people ask me, well, why are you so big on getting kids back into schools? Because I've been looking at this projected data since April, and this bears out globally and again, because McKinsey really correlated this with other information we had from other kinds of what I call community traumatic events that led to school closures. And so we knew that this was coming. Next slide. So here what you see is what that disparate impact looks like when we disaggregate according to student group. And to no one's surprise, but important to note, is that the loss to some of our most vulnerable students is just exacerbated within these discussions of learning loss with remote instruction. And so when you look and see the percentage of K-12 students that actually will be negatively impacted, what this shows is that the learning loss for Black students, for Hispanic students, for low income students is markedly larger than it is for students overall or for white students in particular. And so what I interpret that to mean is that we have to do a better job, again, proactively and in an ongoing basis, targeting some of our most vulnerable learners. What you don't see in this breakout, but are in others, are the exacerbated impact for ELL learners, as well as for students with disabilities, which we are certainly facing. And when folks say, I can always tell people who are not doing on the ground work, and I don't mean that disparagingly, when people say, well, we'd rather have kids alive than, not, than miss a year of school. And certainly the health risks are in fact there. However, I think we are naive if we think that for our most vulnerable students, a year plus of learning loss does not have lifetime impact, when McKinsey and others have studied over years the impact to lifelong learning from being behind a year and a half in terms of schooling. If we look at students in places that have had disrupted learning, these are lifelong impacts. And so I think we need to put that in context, certainly what we have been doing in city schools as we work to offer families options. Next slide. So this is some of our own data internally, and part of why this is particularly striking for me is because we have been working over the last 3 or 4 years really focused on the priority of literacy. As I'm sure many, if not all of you know, it's been a focus area for us. We had seen some upticks with regard to our early learning. Certainly 54%, 59% is not where we want it to be, but we have been seeing marked improvement over the last few years. When I came to Baltimore, we had about 13% of students reading at college and career ready levels. And we've been chipping away at that. Well, if you take a look at this chart, this is some of our early DIBELS performance data, and this is Baltimore data. And the headline on this is that the pandemic, the lack of connection to school and that schooling experience is impacting our students here. as it is across the country. And I say the country because there are other countries, frankly, who are not experiencing at this level because the community, the country, the state has prioritized opening schools and reconnecting kids to schools. Jenny, next slide. Great. This is just more research. And the headline on this slide is that basically what we have said, and I know that there have been suggestions about just having everybody in certain school districts repeat a grade next year. And what we know, particularly for Black and Brown students, for low income students, is that just repeating a grade is insufficient. And so what we have, and frankly doesn't work and didn't work pre-pandemic. So what we've really focused on is what are the other strategies that we know can help make up that content. So we've worked particularly in mathematics to say what is the essential content that students need to master if they are going to move to the next level in math. And so we've prioritized those skill areas, which has been some fabulous work with our partners at Eureka Math around that. And then we also have had done similar work around, again, streamlining standards and then making sure that we're building supports around that, such as our tutoring. We've had a really serious lift around recruiting, particularly college students, community members for tutoring. Many who actually, one of the things we're finding in some of our small work around the tutoring is that when we are partnering our students with young African-American college students, they are actually connecting in ways that just are not about the content, but about relationship that then leads to more engagement around the content. So we know we're going to have to do work around that. I'm sorry if I'm talking fast. I'm trying to make sure I leave enough time for questions. Next slide. The in-person learning, this quote just, I think, captures a lot of what has been our driver, that is to balance the need to absolutely be safe and to make sure that our staff and students are safe, but not being ignorant of the theme that I think I've touched on a bit already, which is that we can't hide the fact that being out of school disproportionately harms low-income students, students of color, and those students with disabilities. And so that has been driving our prioritization of which student groups we bring back, and also has to drive the conversation, I would say, excuse me, about who and how we return to in-person learning. Next slide. You'll see some of our in-person learning opportunities that we have had. And this just reflects who we're talking about when I say prioritize student groups. And so these groups of learners have been those that we have prioritized as we have discussed, implemented, and planned for future in-person learning opportunities. Next slide. So the rollout of those in-person learning opportunities, you'll see some here. We began with summer school programming, and the beauty of doing that was not just the teachers, the principals, our central staff who rolled up their sleeves to do this. And it was relatively a small number of students in that it was 200. But I think what it signifies is really the start of our ability to demonstrate that you can successfully open schools in a way that is safe, in a way that does not feed in-school transmission, and reflects what we are seeing in other school districts across the country, if not across the state, and across the world. Next slide. So this is one of my favorite John Maxwell quotes for this season. And part of it is because it will allow me to kind of quickly highlight some of the things that we are finding during this time that actually are innovations, successes that we actually want to continue even with a return to school. So one of the things I've been really happy about is our college and career office. We have been able to really expand our dual enrollment virtually. One of the classes I've sat in on which is around global history of disease and medicine, really allowed us to build on some early work, but expand it that we had done with BCCC, University of Baltimore, Bard College, which is the operator for our Bard College Early High School here in Baltimore City. And previously, really the only students who had access to that was if you went to Bard or if you were in a school that did, some dual enrollment. And what we were able to do is to really expand the access to students who are not just in our entrance criteria high schools, which has traditionally been where people feel like they're going to find these kinds of courses. So you have Bard College professors teaching things like the history of Black Baltimore and global history of disease and medicine. One example of this that I love highlighting, and I have now reached the point a couple of months that I don't break down in tears, telling the story of Eager Street Academy, which are our incarcerated students. And that we had, a full class at Eager Street who took 2 classes at University of Baltimore, received some of the highest GPAs of any of the Baltimore City students who were enrolled in those courses. When we interviewed those students after and said kind of what happened, what was it, they talked about the fact that it was their first time in their entire schooling career where they felt like they were part of an intellectual academic community. They got to take courses that reflected their interest, their history, and that made the difference. And so here we had, again, some of our most vulnerable students are incarcerated students who were successfully taking college level courses for credit at the University of Baltimore and doing levels of work that they previously had never engaged in. And so the pandemic has allowed us to really blow out our expectations around who can have access practically to high level and enriching content. Our opportunity culture pilot, this has enabled us, the headline on this is something that has been a question, one, in the research for numbers of years. Back when I was at Education Trust, we did a number of studies. And one of the things we found that is verified in the research is that those students who are furthest behind are least likely to have access to the highest quality and most successful teachers. And people get nervous of all ilk when I tell them, actually, it's not the school your child goes to. There's greater difference in classrooms within schools with regards to teacher quality than there is between schools. And so what this pandemic has allowed us to do is really build on some of the work with an opportunity culture pilot that really is focused on how do we think of organizing teacher roles in different ways. Highlight of this, what really spurred this was in the spring, we had Miss Fort, an amazing 5th grade math teacher at Cecil Elementary. Believe me, I wanted my 2 in her class. Amazing outcomes, fabulous African-American math teacher who she started just teaching her students virtually. Then she expanded to teaching the whole 5th grade at her school. And then further on in the spring, we had her teaching 5th grade across 10 different schools within the city. And what that allowed us to do as a precursor to this opportunity culture pilot is actually take a teacher who was expert at the upfront, at what we call the lesson set, at the direct teach, and then allowed other teachers who were frankly stronger in small group to come behind or to come after that teaching to then work with small groups of students. It's not how we traditionally think of teachers working, but it allowed us to move roles and the technology allowed us to do that. And then I think we have one, do we have one more or is that it? Yep, we have one more. And then another piece is our small group Wednesdays. We had a lot of school districts, a lot of people heard of schools who had what they would call asynchronous Wednesdays. We have a group of teachers now Some of they are members of the CEO Teacher Advisory Committee, some of our best teachers instructionally across the district who are working on something called Small Group Wednesdays, which is not just, okay, it's asynchronous day for everybody, knowing that some kids will take the day off, but actually how do we match what students need on a day where the classes are more unstructured, so that students who need, for example, more advising at the high school level are able to get that, where a second grader who needs work on fluency can get that. And then some students, like actually my daughter, who some folks who were on early might have heard me, she was working on her work, actually can do some individual projects on their own because they're at the place they can do that. So a lot of the small group Wednesdays came directly from feedback from our teacher advisory council, from teachers actually on the ground doing the work. And I will end there so that we have time for questions. But I love this quote from How We Got to Now, which is actually a great piece that describes scientific innovations throughout the 20th century. And part of why I love this quote is because it really does build on this idea of how do we use this time that we're in, not just in reactive technical response, which is clearly and absolutely needed, but how do we move to the next level of actually working together in new ways to find new ways of doing work.